Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 29th of July. I'm Erin Viner, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. We open with Lebanese media reports of an Israeli drone strike on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights this afternoon. The British-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says that 5 people were killed, including members of militias affiliated with Iran. The sources say that a missile fired by the Israeli drone hit a car inside of the town of Hadar, killing 2 men from Hezbollah and 3 others from an additional Iranian-aligned faction loyal to Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Well, it was a day of drama at Bet El, where 2 apartment buildings were demolished on orders from the High Court as border police held back angry and stunned residents. The government was powerless to stop the razing, but quickly approved plans to build 300 new homes in the same community. We get more from IBA's Aryeh O'Sullivan.
After days of violent scuffles between English settler youth and border police riot units came the heavy equipment. Demolition began on the so-called Beit Dreinhof apartment buildings this afternoon after the High Court of Justice rejected an appeal of their demolition order yesterday. The excavators tore into the buildings where 24 families were to live, knocking them into rubble. As fate would have it, the demolition of the structures came exactly a decade since the Israel army demolished thousands of homes of settlers in Gush Katif during the disengagement from the Gaza Strip. Reactions were as hot as the summer heat. Habayit Yehudi's Moti Yogev called for the Supreme Court to be bulldozed. And Meretz MK Ilan Gilon blasted the settlers for wanton disregard of the law in raising their hands against IDF soldiers. Under pressure from his right-wing partners, the Prime Minister's office released a statement announcing the immediate construction of 300 housing units in Beit El. Approval was also given for 413 new apartments in the Jewish neighborhoods of eastern Jerusalem. Lawyers from Yesh Din, representing the Palestinian landowner in Beit El, who petitioned the High Court of Justice, said they would also fight any new plans to build on the same spot.
And the Palestinians, protected persons in the West Bank, they have only one institution that can defend their rights, unfortunately, and that is the Supreme Court. Supreme Court is not a body, not an institution that is being affected by political atmosphere like the Minister of Defense or the Prime Minister office or the Ministry of Justice or other ministerial bodies. This is something that we should praise and we should cherish for its ability to protect the weak people in the society and even those who are not part of the Israeli society but under its occupation like the Palestinian owners.
Israeli spy Jonathan Pollard will be released from prison on November 20th after serving 30 years of a life sentence, but he will not be allowed to leave the United States for 5 years according to the terms of his parole. IBA's Eli Wogelenter brings us the story.
The U.S. Parole Commission announced yesterday that Jonathan Pollard, the former Navy intelligence analyst whose conviction of spying for Israel stoked fierce international passions, has been granted parole. He will be released from prison in November, 3 decades after he was arrested while trying to gain asylum at the Israel Embassy in Washington. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke last night with Esther Pollard, Jonathan's wife, and issued a statement saying, "Throughout his time in prison, I consistently raised the issue of his release in my meetings and conversations with the leadership of successive U.S. administrations. We are looking forward to his release." But it appears that Pollard will not be moving to Israel just yet. U.S. law specifies that for 5 years after their release, parolees have to receive government permission for any travel abroad. The White House made clear yesterday that this would not happen, noting Pollard had committed very serious crimes and would serve his sentence under the law. The president has no intention of altering the terms of Mr. Pollard's parole, said a spokesman for the National Security Council. White House officials strongly denied that the release was tied to the nuclear deal reached with Iran or that it was intended as a concession to Israel. Secretary of State John Kerry, who testified before Congress on the nuclear deal yesterday, told reporters that Pollard's release is not related to the Iran nuclear deal. "I haven't even had a conversation about it during the negotiations," Kerry said. "No, not at all." Israel has recognized Pollard as an Israeli agent and granted him citizenship. Pollard's case has been a source of contention between the U.S. and Israel since his arrest, with Israel routinely calling for his release and the U.S. government refusing. Pollard is the only person in U.S. history to receive a life sentence for spying for an ally, and the only American citizen convicted of such a crime to be sentenced to more than 10 years in prison. Eli Wogelenter, IBA News.
Joining me now in the studio to discuss these latest developments concerning Jonathan Pollard is attorney Nat Lewin. Thank you very much for coming in this afternoon.
It's a pleasure, Aaron. Thank you.
Now, you've been very familiar with this case for decades, and until now, you serve as the attorney for Aviam Sela, who is Pollard's Israeli handler. What's your reaction to the setting of Pollard's parole at this point?
Well, I'm delighted, as I think the entire Jewish world is really delighted. It's about time that the United States has released Jonathan Pollard, who, after all, was given a sentence far too severe and far in excess of what anybody else in the United States who committed a similar offense was given. So it's a time for celebrating his release.
Now, the U.S. kept him in prison for 30 years out of the life sentence. Why do you think all efforts to secure an early release for Jonathan Pollard failed?
Well, I think there clearly was very heavy resistance from the intelligence and defense communities in the United States. There's the story about President Bill Clinton being told that there would be substantial resignations, Mr. Tenet and others, if in fact he released Jonathan Pollard, although he had promised apparently
Around the Y
him.
River Conference.
At the Y River Conference,
Yeah.
correct. So for reasons that really remain unknown, the defense and intelligence communities have resisted this release. The famous letter that Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger submitted at the time of the sentencing has been blamed, probably accurately, for the extended stay that Jonathan Pollard has had in prison.
Now, of course, as everybody knows, Pollard isn't really going to be experiencing true freedom because the parole comes with limitations, such as the fact that he can't leave the United States for 5 years. Is this because of vindictiveness, or is something else at play?
I think the Parole Commission has really acted independently the way a Parole Commission is supposed to do. I don't think that this is vindictiveness, but the Parole Commission has, consistent with the very hard line it has taken Jonathan Pollard, imposed this 5-year ban on his leaving the United States. And I think their reason, and it may have been entirely independent, but based on this information that they've been fed over the years, their reason is, I think, to avoid having Jonathan Pollard arrive in Israel and be celebrated as a hero. I think the Parole Commission has determined that he will have to stay in the United States in order to avoid that kind of incident.
Can the Pollards eventually challenge this ban at any point?
Yes, Pollard has been represented for a period of time by excellent lawyers. Eli Lauer, who I know personally, has been working tirelessly. Jacques Semmelman, who's been working with him, both excellent lawyers. And I think they may very well appeal that provision, but unfortunately that's still within the Parole Commission process.
Can you briefly explain to us what it meant when he was sentenced to a life term in prison and the Parole Commission basically took 15 years off of that?
Well, what happens is, under the regulations at the time, the Parole Commission used to be far more independent of regulations back in the days when I began to practice law. And then the law changed to restrict their authority. At the time Pollard was sentenced, a life sentence would have mandated 45 years in prison. They still had this authority to consider parole at the 2/3 stage, or they could grant parole earlier. There were earlier parole hearings, but that would have been a unusual kind of a grant of a benefit to Pollard.
Right.
Now, they could have stuck with a 45-year date. They told Pollard's attorneys that they would consider 30 years rather than 45 years. So the Parole Commission actually did something in that context that was beneficial to Pollard.
Attorney Nat Lewin, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your insight with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Former President Shimon Peres was long active in the struggle to free Jonathan Pollard and says that he was thrilled to hear the news of his parole.
I would like to express my appreciation for the decision to release Pollard from his prison. It's a very moving decision, both personally and otherwise. personally, because imagine for a person to sit 30 years, day in, day out, alone in a prison. Even when you're a prisoner, you don't stop to be a human being. And second, I think it's a fair process, considering the Constitution and the way of law in the United States of America. Actually, I talked with President Obama about it, and he told me that he will let the legal process to take its course. There won't be any political objection to it. He asked me not to say about it a word, which I didn't, but it happened as he has said.
Joining me now to discuss the Pollard case is former Knesset member Dov Lipman, who served on the Knesset lobby for Pollard. Thank you very much for coming in this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Now, I understand that you've been very conscious of this case since childhood. Can you tell us under what circumstances that happened?
I was a ninth grader in high school when Jonathan Pollard was arrested about 30 minutes away.
Oh my God, you're really
I was
young.
in school in Silver Spring, Maryland. That wasn't the purpose of the story. And I actually remember being very angry as a young teenager that someone was arrested for spying for an ally of the United States. And my father of blessed memory, who was a federal judge, he said, Dov, he broke the law, and he has to pay the price for that, and he has to go to jail. And that's something which stuck with me from that moment onwards until then I found myself on the other side fighting for his release in the Knesset.
Do you agree with the assessment that all of Israel's efforts over the years to free Pollard basically amounted to nothing?
On a certain level, that's correct. I don't think we really had a chance. And I think people make a mistake when they say that this was an anti-Israel sentiment. We had 5 American presidents who served since Pollard was arrested. You can't say that all 5 were anti-Israel anyway. They're not anti-Israel. They were pro-America. Their job is to serve America's interests. And for whatever reasons, these were America's interests. And every effort that we made, including every meeting I ever had with a congressman, senator, governor, and everyone else within the Knesset, we raised the issue, but we failed because they're preserving an American interest and not the Israeli interest.
Once he has been freed, do you think that it will come time eventually for another campaign for the Pollard's right to move to Israel?
I think it's best for that campaign to be very quiet. I think the effort will be made. I think it's a big mistake for there to be a loud, vocal, public campaign for this. I think that we've sort of learned our lesson from this story that, again, American interests are going to be what the leaders in America take into account. Quietly, under the radar screen, I think there will be an effort for him to come to Israel at some point in the near future. I don't think it'll happen immediately upon his release, but at some point I do believe, I hope we'll succeed in bringing him to Israel.
Ultimately, what do you feel is the message about the Pollard case that it has for American Jewry and Israel?
For American Jewry, I think it's a very, very startling message, and that is you have to realize that you live in the United States of America, and your public servants swear allegiance to the United States of America. Of course, Israel's an ally and a friend, but when there's ever a conflict, they're going to choose America. That's why we created a state of Israel, and now I'll shift to the Israel side. We have to always realize that we have to look out for our interests, our best friends in the world, not because they dislike us, not because they're not interested in our welfare. They will choose what's best for their country, and we have to always make sure that we are choosing what's best for our country and strengthen that. But that's why we have an Israel, and that's an important message for Jews around the world.
Rabbi Dov Lipman, former Knesset member and former member of the Knesset lobby for Pollard, thank you very much for coming in. And
thank you. And it's a happy day. It's a happy day to know that Jonathan's going to be released.
It is
all the politics aside, we're so happy.
It's a very happy day. Thank you very much. In other news, congressional hearings on the Iranian nuclear accord are continuing in Washington, where U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is making his case for the deal, although many congressmen are still skeptical.
Will not only be giving Iran a free pass to double the pace of its uranium enrichment, to build a heavy water reactor, to install new and more efficient centrifuges, but they will do it all without the unprecedented inspection and transparency measures that we've secured. Everything that we have tried to prevent will now happen. Now, what's worse? If we walk away alone. Our partners are not going to be with us. Instead, they'll walk away from the tough multilateral sanctions that brought Iran to the negotiating table in the first place. And we will have squandered the best chance that we have to solve this problem through peaceful means.
If this agreement goes through, Iran gets a cash bonanza, a boost to its international standing, and a lighted path toward nuclear weapons. With sweeping sanctions relief, we have lessened our ability to challenge Iran's conduct across the board. As Iran grows stronger, we will be weaker to respond.
Already, we're seeing Iran's leadership declare that military sites will be off-limits to inspectors. If this is Iran's version of transparency during the implementation of the agreement, we're getting off to a bad start.
I want to focus, Secretary Kerry, on your remarks that we've got to focus about dealing with Iran's non-nuclear behavior. And you say we'll be in a stronger position to deal with that, and we have to deal with it. They're holding 4 American hostages. Assad is killing 5,000 people a month, at least, and the blood is on the hands of men in Tehran. And they're supporting Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi, and those are just the organizations that begin with the letter H.
In the aftermath of its nuclear deal with world powers, Iran has opened talks with the European Union on a range of issues. EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini is in Tehran, where she met with Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif to discuss a range of topics, including energy, trade, transportation, the environment, human rights, and more.
And I think that this deal has shown very clearly that diplomacy and multilateralism do bring results if all the parties are committed with strong political will and with patience and with determination. And I think this was a good news for the entire region, for the world. And indeed, now it is time to show that not only reaching the deal, but starting to work on the implementation of the deal is going to be historical. The new chapter we can open, this agreement can lead to open, is a different framework for the region. This is probably going to be one of the most difficult chapters to be opened, but I believe that this is going to be one of the most relevant ones. If we will manage to support a different understanding of the dynamics in the region, one that is based on cooperation rather than confrontation or competition, this would lead to benefits for all in the region and beyond.
Now taking a look at local finance, and the shekel today lost strength against all major foreign currencies, while share prices on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange were up across the board. Here's a look at the numbers. The IBA weather team tells us we're going to see another rise in temperatures tomorrow with warmer and drier conditions than normal for this time of year. Here's the forecast at home and abroad over the next 24 hours. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. We hope you'll join us again tomorrow, and I'll be back to bring the latest breaking news from Israel. I'm Erin Viner, wishing you a cool evening, and shalom from Jerusalem.